I built Northbridge Dynamics from a cramped garage office with one laptop, 2 folding chairs, and a stubborn belief that persistence beats talent when talent gets comfortable. 22 years later, our software ran logistics networks across 3 continents, our name appeared in industry magazines, and our boardroom overlooked the skyline like a quiet reminder that impossible things sometimes become routine. People like to imagine success as a straight road, but it never is. It's a maze of late nights, risks that feel reckless, and moments when the only thing you truly own is the decision to keep going. That's why the email I received one Tuesday morning felt strange the second I read it. It arrived at 6:12 a.m., before most of the office lights were even on. The subject line was simple: mandatory board meeting, 9 a.m. The message was even shorter. Daniel, the board requires your presence for an urgent executive review. No greeting. No explanation. Just that. I leaned back in my chair and read it again. Over 2 decades, I had attended hundreds of board meetings, but none had ever sounded like this. Urgent executive review. Those words have weight in a company like ours. They usually mean someone is about to lose power. What I didn't know yet was that someone was supposed to be me. By 8:45 that morning I walked into the Northbridge headquarters lobby, and something immediately felt off. Conversation stopped when I passed. A few managers gave me polite nods that looked rehearsed rather than natural. My assistant Olivia Grant met me near the elevator with a look I recognized instantly. Concern. Olivia had worked beside me for 9 years. She knew how to read a room better than most executives. Daniel, she said quietly, stepping closer, something strange has been happening the past few days. I raised an eyebrow. Strange how? She hesitated for a moment before answering. Victor Langford has been holding private meetings. Late ones. With Claire Whitmore and Ethan Rowe. That made me pause. Victor Langford was the chairman of the board. Claire Whitmore was our corporate lawyer. Ethan Rowe was the CFO. If those 3 were meeting secretly, it meant decisions were being made somewhere outside my office. When did this start? I asked. About a week ago, Olivia replied. And Daniel, they've been using the Meridian Hotel conference rooms across the street. That detail stuck with me. Corporate strategy doesn't happen in hotel conference rooms unless someone is trying to keep it quiet. I thanked Olivia and walked into the elevator, watching the numbers climb slowly toward the top floor where the boardroom waited. I wish I could say I knew exactly what was coming, but I didn't. I only knew something had shifted. When the elevator doors opened, the hallway outside the boardroom was silent. The glass doors were already closed, which meant everyone else had arrived before me. That alone was unusual. Board members rarely show up early unless they're eager to witness something dramatic. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside. Victor Langford sat at the head of the table, fingers neatly folded as if he were posing for a corporate portrait. Claire Whitmore sat beside him with a thick legal folder open in front of her. Ethan Rowe sat 2 seats down, staring at the table instead of at me. The other directors watched quietly as I walked to my chair. Victor smiled politely, but it wasn't the friendly smile I was used to seeing. It was the careful smile of someone about to deliver a rehearsed line. Daniel, he said, thank you for joining us. I sat down slowly. You said this meeting was urgent. Claire Whitmore slid a document across the table toward me. We'll get straight to the point, she said calmly. The board has raised concerns regarding your ability to continue serving as CEO of Northbridge Dynamics. I looked down at the paper. At the top was a bold title, Executive Competency Evaluation. For a second I thought it had to be a mistake. My ability? I asked quietly. Victor leaned forward. Daniel, the past year has been stressful for the company. The board believes it would be responsible to evaluate whether executive supervision may be beneficial. Supervision. That word landed like a stone in the middle of the room. I looked around the table. No one spoke. No one challenged the statement. That was the moment I understood what was happening. This wasn't a meeting. It was an ambush. Someone had decided I was no longer supposed to be in charge of the company I built. Claire continued speaking, her tone perfectly professional. The board proposes a formal medical and cognitive evaluation to determine whether temporary leadership adjustments are necessary. Temporary leadership adjustments. Another polished phrase for the same idea. Remove the founder. Replace the CEO. Victor folded his hands again. Daniel, this is simply a precaution. The company must come first. I looked at each face around the table, one by one. Some avoided my eyes. Others watched carefully, waiting for my reaction. What none of them seemed to remember in that moment was one very important detail. A detail that would change everything once the numbers were finally spoken out loud. Because while they were discussing supervision and leadership transitions, there was one fact sitting quietly in the shareholder records that made their entire plan impossible. Northbridge Dynamics had millions of shares. The board controlled many of them. Investors controlled many more. But the largest portion, the majority, belonged to one person. Me. Daniel Mercer. 62%. And the moment they realized that, the entire room was going to change. Now before we go further into what happened next, and trust me the next part shocked even the board members who planned this meeting, make sure you subscribe to the channel because this story only gets more unbelievable from here, and the truth about what Victor Langford tried to do inside that boardroom will leave you questioning how power really works in the corporate world. When you build a company from the ground up, you learn something very important about people. Problems never appear suddenly. They start as whispers. Small changes. Quiet conversations that stop the moment you walk into the room. And once I walked out of that boardroom after Victor Langford questioned my ability to run the company I built, those whispers suddenly made sense. That meeting wasn't spontaneous. It was the final step of something that had been growing quietly behind my back for weeks. Maybe even months. At first the signs were small. Emails that used to include me suddenly didn't. Department meetings were scheduled without my approval. Financial reports started arriving later than usual. At the time I assumed it was just the chaos of expansion. Northbridge Dynamics had doubled its workforce in 3 years. Rapid growth can create confusion. But now I realized something else had been happening. Someone had been slowly building a case against me. That afternoon, Olivia Grant walked into my office and closed the door behind her. She didn't even sit down. Daniel, she said quietly, I think you need to see something. She placed a printed calendar on my desk. It showed a series of evening meetings scheduled at the Meridian Hotel across the street. The same hotel she had mentioned earlier. 3 names appeared repeatedly on those reservations. Victor Langford. Claire Whitmore. Ethan Rowe. The chairman of the board. The corporate lawyer. And the CFO. When those 3 meet privately again and again, it's not social conversation. It's strategy. How long has this been happening? I asked. Olivia took a slow breath. About 3 weeks. 3 weeks. That meant the boardroom ambush had been planned long before that morning email arrived. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the calendar. 22 years building this company. And somehow a group of executives believed they could quietly move me out of my own office. But the more I thought about it, the clearer their strategy became. Victor Langford wasn't reckless. He was careful. The type of man who never made a move until every piece on the chessboard was exactly where he wanted it. Removing a CEO isn't easy. Removing a founder is even harder. So he wasn't trying to fire me. That would create backlash. Investors would ask questions. Employees would panic. Instead, he chose a more subtle weapon. Doubt. If the board could convince people that the founder was no longer mentally fit to lead, then replacing him wouldn't look like betrayal. It would look like responsibility. That's why Claire Whitmore had arrived at the meeting with a legal folder. That's why they wanted a medical evaluation. They weren't just removing me. They were building a narrative. A story where the board stepped in to protect the company. A story where Victor Langford became the calm hero who stabilized leadership. It was clever, cold, and extremely calculated. But what Victor didn't understand was that I had spent 2 decades studying people inside this industry. And once you know what someone is trying to do, you can usually see the next move before they make it. The following morning, another email arrived. This one came directly from Claire Whitmore. Daniel Mercer is scheduled for Executive Cognitive Evaluation Thursday at 10 a.m. with Drive Samuel Reeves. No discussion. No request. Just a schedule. They had already decided the outcome they wanted. The evaluation was just a step in the script. Later that day I passed Ethan Rowe in the hallway outside the finance department. Normally Ethan was confident. Sharp. The type of CFO who enjoyed explaining numbers to investors like a professor lecturing a class. But when he saw me walking toward him, something strange happened. He froze for a moment, then quickly looked down at his phone as if reading something urgent. "Ethan," I said calmly. He looked up slowly. "Daniel." I studied his face for a moment. People underestimate how much you can learn from silence. Guilt is rarely loud. It hides in small gestures. Avoided eye contact. Nervous movements. Ethan had both. "Busy week?" I asked. He forced a smile that looked painfully artificial. "Just the usual financial reports." I nodded. "Of course." Then I walked past him. But as I continued down the hallway I understood something important. Victor might be the architect of the plan. Claire might be the legal mind shaping it. But Ethan was the weak link. Because people who feel confident in their decisions don't avoid eye contact. They stand tall. They explain themselves. Ethan Rowe looked like a man who had realized he might have joined the wrong side of a very dangerous game. That evening I stayed in my office longer than usual, watching the city lights appear one by one across the skyline. The office floor slowly emptied until the building became quiet. 22 years ago I had sat in a garage dreaming about building a company that would change logistics software forever. Now that company employed more than 400 people. Families depended on it. Careers depended on it. And a small group inside the boardroom believed they could quietly take control by convincing everyone that the founder had lost his mind. I almost laughed when that thought crossed my mind. Because the truth was much simpler. They didn't understand the one rule that determines who really holds power in a company. Titles can be voted away. Offices can be reassigned. Authority can shift overnight. But ownership is different. Ownership doesn't disappear because someone calls a meeting. And somewhere inside the shareholder records of Northbridge Dynamics was a number that Victor Langford had clearly forgotten to check before starting his quiet little conspiracy. 62%. My shares. My company. My vote. And the moment the board realized that number still existed, their entire plan was going to collapse in front of them. But before that happened, they were about to make one more mistake. The medical evaluation they scheduled for Thursday. Because the doctor they hired to question my mental fitness was about to discover something none of them expected. Not only was I perfectly capable of running the company, I had already started planning how to end their conspiracy the moment the truth reached the boardroom. By Thursday morning the story inside Northbridge Dynamics had already started spreading through quiet conversations in hallways and break rooms. No one said it directly, but people were asking the same question in different ways. Was the founder losing control? Was the board preparing to replace him? Rumors move fast inside a company, especially when leadership suddenly becomes silent. But rumors didn't bother me. What bothered me was the arrogance behind the plan Victor Langford had created. Because the more I thought about it, the clearer his strategy became. He believed that if the board could label me unstable, then removing me would look responsible instead of ruthless. Investors would accept it. Employees would accept it. And Victor would step into the leadership vacuum as the calm, rational chairman saving the company from chaos. It was a clever story. The only problem was that it wasn't true. At exactly 10 o'clock that morning I walked into a quiet medical office across the city where Dr. Samuel Reeves was waiting. The board had chosen him carefully. He was one of the most respected neurologists in the region. His opinion carried weight. Which meant if he declared that I was unfit to lead, the board would have the credibility they needed to move forward with their plan. Dr. Reeves stood when I entered the room and offered a polite handshake. He looked calm and professional, the type of doctor who spent more time listening than speaking. "Mr. Mercer," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk, "thank you for coming." I sat down and studied him for a moment. "Let me guess," I said with a small smile. "The board told you they're concerned about my mental fitness." He didn't look surprised. "They expressed concerns about executive stress and decision-making under pressure," he replied calmly. "My role is simply to evaluate your cognitive performance and neurological health." I nodded slowly. "Fair enough." For the next 2 hours the evaluation began. Memory exercises. Pattern recognition tests. Strategic reasoning scenarios. Mathematical problem solving. Dr. Reeves asked questions that seemed simple at first but quickly became complex. Financial hypotheticals. Leadership dilemmas. Risk calculations. The kind of mental puzzles that expose whether someone is thinking clearly or simply reacting emotionally. I answered each question calmly, sometimes even enjoying the challenge. Running a company forces you to think like this every day. Every contract, every negotiation, every expansion decision involves analyzing risk and opportunity at the same time. Halfway through the evaluation, Dr. Reeves leaned back slightly and studied me more carefully. "You seem remarkably relaxed for someone undergoing a cognitive evaluation requested by their own board of directors," he said. I shrugged lightly. "Doctor, when you've built a company from nothing, you get used to people doubting you." He nodded slowly, writing something in his notebook. The tests continued. After the final exercise he closed the folder in front of him and folded his hands on the desk. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he spoke in a calm, direct tone. "Mr. Mercer, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment." I wasn't surprised. But what he said next surprised even me. "In fact," he continued, "your analytical reasoning scores fall well above the average range for executives your age." I smiled slightly. "I'll make sure the board hears that part clearly." Dr. Reeves chuckled softly. "I suspect they will." The evaluation ended with a simple handshake, but the result meant something much bigger than a medical report. Victor Langford's plan depended on one thing above all else. Credibility. If the doctor declared that the founder of Northbridge Dynamics might be mentally unfit to lead, the board would have justification for their actions. But now that narrative was broken. Completely. When I walked back into the Northbridge headquarters that afternoon, the building felt different. The rumors were still there, floating quietly between departments, but now I carried something Victor didn't expect. Proof. Proof that his carefully constructed story had just collapsed. Olivia Grant was waiting in my office when I arrived. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. I placed the evaluation report on my desk. "The doctor says my brain still works." She laughed with relief. "Good to know." I leaned against the desk and looked out the window toward the skyline again. "Victor won't like this outcome," I said. Olivia crossed her arms. "What do you think he'll do now?" I thought about that question carefully. Victor Langford wasn't the type of man who abandoned a plan halfway through. He was ambitious, calculated, and confident in his own intelligence. Which meant he would probably make the same mistake many ambitious people make when they believe they're smarter than everyone else. He would double down. And that meant the next board meeting was going to be far more interesting than he expected. Because by Monday morning every director in that boardroom would be looking at two very important pieces of information. The medical report proving I was perfectly capable of running the company. And the shareholder records showing something Victor clearly forgot to consider before launching his quiet little coup. 62% ownership. My shares. My vote. My control. And the moment that number entered the conversation, the entire room was going to realize something Victor Langford should have checked before trying to remove the founder of Northbridge Dynamics. You cannot vote out the person who owns the majority of the company. But Victor was about to learn that lesson the hard way. And the boardroom meeting scheduled for Monday morning was about to become the most uncomfortable meeting of his entire career. Monday morning arrived with the kind of quiet tension that spreads through a building before something important happens. Northbridge Dynamics looked the same from the outside, glass walls reflecting the sunrise, employees walking through the lobby with coffee cups and laptops, but inside the company there was a feeling that something big was about to unfold. Rumors had been circulating for days. People didn't know the details, but they knew the board had challenged the founder. And when a board challenges the founder of a company he built from nothing, everyone starts paying attention. I arrived at the office earlier than usual that morning. The elevators were almost empty, the hallways quiet, the lights in most offices still off. But the boardroom lights were already on. That was the first sign Victor Langford had been preparing for this moment carefully. When I walked inside, the directors were already seated around the long table. Some looked nervous. Others looked curious. Victor sat confidently at the head of the table as if he were about to deliver a presentation he had rehearsed 100 times. Claire Whitmore sat beside him again with another stack of documents neatly organized in front of her. Ethan Rowe sat further down the table, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. Victor looked up when I entered and gave a calm, controlled smile. "Daniel," he said smoothly, "thank you for joining us." I took my seat without responding immediately. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation. Everyone knew this meeting was not routine. Victor began speaking almost immediately. "Before we begin," he said, "the board would like to review the results of the executive evaluation requested last week." Claire stood and walked to the large screen at the front of the room. She connected her laptop and opened a document. The medical evaluation appeared on the screen. I watched the faces around the table as the directors read the report quietly. Some nodded slightly. One director even raised his eyebrows in mild surprise. Claire cleared her throat. "According to Dr. Samuel Reeves," she said carefully, "Mr. Mercer shows no signs of cognitive impairment." She paused briefly before continuing. "In fact, the report states his executive decision-making ability remains strong." For a moment the room went silent. Victor's smile faded slightly, but he recovered quickly. "That's good to hear," he said smoothly. "However, the board still believes leadership stability requires careful oversight during this transitional period." Transitional period. Another polished phrase designed to sound harmless. But everyone in the room understood what it meant. Victor wasn't abandoning the plan. He was simply adjusting it. He leaned forward and placed his hands on the table. "Therefore," he continued, "the board proposes appointing an interim executive committee to supervise company operations while we evaluate long-term leadership structure." That sentence hung in the air like a challenge. Because what Victor was really proposing was simple. He wanted to control the company. Not by removing me directly, but by surrounding the CEO with a committee that could override decisions. It was clever, strategic, and completely illegal if the majority shareholder disagreed. I slowly opened the thin folder I had brought with me and placed a document on the table. "Before we vote on anything," I said calmly, "there's something the board should review." Marcus Hale, one of the independent directors, leaned forward as I slid the papers toward the center of the table. "What is this?" he asked. "The current shareholder registry," I replied. Marcus adjusted his glasses and began reading. A few seconds passed. Then his eyes widened slightly. He looked up at Victor. "Victor," he said slowly, "have you reviewed this recently?" Victor frowned slightly. "Of course." Marcus turned the document so the entire table could see the highlighted number printed beside my name. "Then you're aware Daniel Mercer holds 62% of the company's voting shares." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Claire Whitmore immediately picked up the document and flipped through the pages quickly. Ethan Rowe looked down at the table again. Victor stared at the numbers as if they might somehow change if he looked long enough. But numbers in corporate law don't change because someone wishes they would. 62% means control. 62% means every board vote becomes meaningless if the majority owner disagrees. I leaned back slightly in my chair and folded my hands. "You can question my decisions," I said calmly. "You can even question my leadership." I paused and looked directly at Victor. "But you cannot remove the majority owner of this company." Marcus Hale sat back in his chair slowly, still staring at the shareholder records. Another director quietly shook his head. Victor's confidence had completely vanished now. The carefully rehearsed presentation, the legal strategy, the quiet conspiracy. All of it had been built on one fatal mistake. No one had checked who actually owned the company. Victor finally spoke again, but his voice no longer sounded confident. "Daniel, this discussion was meant to ensure stability for Northbridge Dynamics." I smiled slightly. "Exactly," I replied. "And the most stable leadership a company can have is the person who built it and still owns the majority of it." No one spoke after that. Because the truth had already landed in the center of the table like a weight no one could move. The plan Victor Langford had spent weeks preparing had just collapsed in less than 5 minutes. And what happened next would end his career at Northbridge Dynamics permanently. But that part of the story would unfold after this meeting ended. The silence in the boardroom after the shareholder records appeared on the table was the kind of silence that tells you everything has changed. Just a few minutes earlier Victor Langford had been sitting confidently at the head of the table, speaking like a man who already controlled the future of the company. Now he looked like someone who had suddenly realized the floor beneath him wasn't as solid as he believed. The directors around the table were still staring at the document Marcus Hale had turned toward them. My name sat clearly beside one number that could not be ignored. 62%. The majority owner. The controlling vote. In corporate law, that number is power. Real power. Not a title someone can vote away in a single meeting. Not a position that disappears because a board decides it should. Ownership is different. Ownership means the final decision belongs to the person who built the company and invested their life into it. Victor finally cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the room. "Daniel," he said carefully, "this meeting was intended to address leadership concerns, not to challenge your ownership." I looked around the table calmly. "But that's exactly what you tried to do," I replied. "You attempted to remove the CEO without remembering who actually owns the company." No one interrupted because no one could. The facts were sitting right there on the table. Marcus Hale slowly leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Victor," he said quietly, "did you really attempt to restructure executive leadership without reviewing the shareholder registry first?" Victor didn't answer immediately. Claire Whitmore closed the legal folder in front of her, realizing the argument she had prepared no longer mattered. Ethan Rowe still avoided eye contact with everyone in the room. The board had just witnessed something no executive ever wants to experience. A strategy collapsing in real time. After a long moment Victor stood up and adjusted his jacket. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "this discussion should continue privately." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I think this discussion should stay exactly where it is." The directors looked at each other again. Because everyone understood what had just happened. Victor Langford had attempted a quiet corporate coup against the founder of the company. And he had done it without checking the one number that made the entire plan impossible. 62% ownership. Marcus Hale spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Daniel," he said, "are you planning to take action regarding what happened here?" I looked at Victor for a moment before answering. "I believe the company deserves leadership that respects the people who built it," I said. "And leadership that understands the difference between governance and betrayal." That was the moment the meeting ended. Not with a vote. Not with another speech. Just with the quiet understanding that the situation had already resolved itself. Within 48 hours everything changed. Victor Langford resigned as chairman of the board, citing what the press release called strategic differences in leadership direction. Claire Whitmore quietly stepped down as corporate counsel for Northbridge Dynamics. Ethan Rowe submitted his resignation as CFO shortly afterward. The board issued a formal statement reaffirming my role as CEO and majority shareholder of the company. But the most interesting part wasn't the resignations or the statements. It was the reaction inside the company. Because word travels fast in offices, especially when something dramatic happens at the top. Employees who had been nervous earlier in the week now walked through the halls with a new kind of confidence. People realized something important about the company they worked for. Northbridge Dynamics wasn't controlled by politics inside a boardroom. It was still led by the person who built it from nothing 22 years earlier. A week later I stood again in the same boardroom, this time looking out at the skyline while the city lights began to appear. Olivia Grant walked in quietly and placed a folder on the table. "Everything finalized," she said. I nodded and looked at the city below. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally she asked the question that had probably been on many people's minds. "Daniel, did you ever doubt how this would end?" I smiled slightly. "Not really." She tilted her head. "Why not?" I picked up the shareholder report again and pointed to the number printed beside my name. "Because power in a company doesn't always belong to the loudest voice in the room," I said. "Sometimes it belongs to the person who built the room in the first place." Olivia smiled. "Fair point." I looked out the window again as the lights of the city stretched across the horizon. Victor Langford had made one critical mistake. He assumed authority meant control. But authority can be voted away. Titles can disappear overnight. Ownership is different. Ownership is permanent until the owner decides otherwise. And that's the lesson everyone in that boardroom learned the hard way. Before you try to remove someone from their own company, you should probably check who actually owns it. Because in this case the answer was simple. 62%. And that was more than enough to end the entire conspiracy. Now before you go, I'm curious about something. If you've watched this entire story unfold, write in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel across the world. And if you enjoy powerful real-life style stories about strategy, betrayal, and unexpected comebacks like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel because the next story might be even more unbelievable than this one.